8 weeks earlier, she almost didn't open the door. That's the part nobody asks about, not later. Not when everything is resolved and the paperwork is filed and the right names are in the right places. Nobody asks about the woman sitting alone at a kitchen table at 2 a.m, staring at a cup of tea that went cold an hour ago, listening to the atmospheric processors hum through the walls like a held breath that never releases. Nobody asks what she was thinking when the knock came. Eleanor Hale was 59 years old. She would be 60 in March. She had decided not to think about that. She had also decided not to think about the fact that it was 2 a.m. and she was awake. Again. Because thinking about it made it worse. Because the thinking itself was the problem. The ceiling. The quiet. The particular shape of a space designed for 2 people that now held 1. 3 years. That's how long it had been since Thomas died. 3 years. 4 months. And some number of days she had stopped counting because counting made her feel like she was waiting for something. And she was not waiting. She was fine. She was sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, checking maintenance invoices she had already checked twice. Fine. The apartment was in Harrow's Reach. Lower residential ring outer lip of DHT station. The section where the atmosphere processors ran loud enough to hear through the walls, regardless of what you did to the insulation. The corridor lights had been on a dimmer cycle since the maintenance contract lapsed 8 months ago. The building had the specific character of places built for short-term workers, that then quietly became permanent through the accumulation of people who had nowhere else to be. Nell had lived here 11 years. She'd come originally on a survey contract. Mining assessment, geological mapping, the kind of technical work that moved from station to station and suited people who were good with their hands and better with silence. Thomas had been on the same contract. They'd stayed when it ended, because the next one came up nearby, and the one after that. And somewhere in the middle of all those contracts, DHT had stopped being the place they were working and started being the place they lived. He'd been an engineer. Structural primarily. The kind of man who could look at a load-bearing wall and tell you in 3 seconds exactly how much it was carrying and what would happen if you changed it. He used to do that with conversations too. Walk into a room, read the weight of it, know exactly where the stress points were. She missed that. More than she expected to still. She missed having someone who could read a room. The notebook was on the shelf above the stove where it had been since he died. She hadn't opened it. It was his, technically. He'd used it for job notes, material specs, measurements from sites they'd surveyed together. His handwriting on the cover small and precise, the letters of a man who'd been trained to write in conditions where space was limited and accuracy mattered. She looked at it sometimes, from across the kitchen. That was all. The invoices were for the loading bay. She'd moved to cargo work after the last survey contract ended. Not because she'd wanted to. Because there was work available, and she was good with systems, and weight distribution, and the particular logic of how objects moved through space. Her supervisor kept misreading a recurring pallet configuration error as an equipment fault. It was not an equipment fault. It was a loading sequence problem. She'd been trying to explain this for 6 weeks. She was thinking about this, about load tolerances, and the specific frustration of watching someone diagnose the wrong cause with complete confidence when the knock came. Soft. Just twice. The sound of someone who was not sure they deserved an answer. Nell set down the invoices. She looked at the door. She didn't move immediately. Because it was 2 a.m. and knocking at 2 a.m. meant something specific, and she ran through what that something might be before she stood up. Emergency. Probably not. There would be more urgency to it. Neighbor. Possibly. She didn't know her neighbors well. She knew their schedules by sound, their routines by inference, but she hadn't learned their names. She'd meant to in the way you mean to do things you keep not doing. She crossed to the door and opened it. The corridor was dim. The lights on their dimmer cycle, the lower ring's permanent half-dark. And in that half-dark, pressed against the opposite wall, was a young woman who had knocked and then immediately stepped back, giving space, or giving herself room to leave. Probably both. She was very still, hair the color of old copper, damp at the temples and at the side of her neck, as if she'd been moving fast through cold corridors. Skin a pale gray-green, the kind of color that would shift silver in better light. Slightly pointed ears, barely noticeable unless you knew to look. eyes when they found Nell's a dark and careful amber. Kethrani! Nell recognized the phenotype. There was a Kethrani community on sublevel 9. She'd seen them at the market, at the transit junctions, at the water processing units where different settlement populations overlapped. She'd never spoken to one at length. The young woman was wearing a transit worker's jacket 3 sizes too large, holding the collar closed at her throat with one hand. The other hand was flat against the wall behind her, and Nell could see from the angle of her weight, from the careful position of her feet, that she was ready to push off and go. One word from the wrong register and she would. They looked at each other. The processors ran. Then the young woman said in a voice that was not quite a whisper, but was the register just above it, the register of someone who has made a decision and is stating it with precision and no volume at all. I can cook, I can clean, I can stay quiet. She said it without looking away, without any shift in expression, the way you read from a list you have been rehearsing. Just the facts of what she could offer laid out plainly, as if she had learned at some earlier point that asking for anything beyond what you could demonstrably give in return was an efficient way to be turned away. Nell looked at her. She looked at the jacket that wasn't hers, the damp hair, the careful stillness, the hand flat on the wall. She looked at the amber eyes that were working very hard at being unreadable and almost succeeding. She thought it is 2 a.m. She thought the second room has been empty for 3 years. She thought Thomas would have had the door open already. She stepped back. Come in then, she said. Her name was Senna Vale. Nell found that out 20 minutes later after she'd put the kettle on and set a second cup on the table, and Senna had come inside and stood very precisely in the center of the kitchen, not near the window, not near the door, not near anything, the center where she could see all of it and was touching none of it. She watched Nell move through the space with the concentrated attention of someone memorizing a layout, a survival behavior. Nell recognized it without being able to say exactly how. She moved slowly, kept her hands visible, opened the cabinet for the tea and left it open. Senna Vale, the young woman said when Nell asked. She gave her own name with the slight front stress of Kethrani phonology, a settlement pronunciation sublevel 9. Nell Hale, Nell said. From here mostly. She set the second cup in front of the chair across from hers and sat down. Senna stayed standing. For a moment, Nell could see her working through something, some internal calculation, some assessment of risk and probability, and what the available data suggested about the person sitting across from her. Then, as if the math had come out in favor, she pulled out the chair and sat. She didn't touch the cup immediately. She looked at it. You're not going to ask what happened, she said. You can tell me if you want, Nell said. You don't have to. A pause. Most people ask. Most people, Nell said, aren't my business at 2 a.m. She picked up her own cup. The tea's a standard blend. I don't know if it's close to what you'd find on 9. I've been meaning to get to the sublevel market. Something happened in Senna's face, small and controlled. A shift so minimal Nell almost missed it. The young woman picked up the cup. They sat in the kitchen and the processors hummed outside, and she drank her tea and Nell let her drink it in silence, because silence was not the same as nothing. And she could tell, watching the careful way Senna held the cup, that this was a person who understood that too. When the cup was about half empty, Senna set it down. I have 40 credits, she said, looking at the table. That is what I have left. You don't need to pay, Nell said. Senna looked up sharply, the first quick movement she'd made. There's a second room, Nell said. She kept her voice even. Small. It has a cot and a storage unit. The window faces the corridor side, so you'll hear the foot traffic on first shift. The door locks from the inside. A pause. I don't use it for anything. I am not asking for charity, Senna said. Flat and precise. Not angry, setting a record straight. I know you're not, Nell said. You offered to cook and clean. I'm not taking you up on that. You can just stay. Why? Not a question. A requirement. Give me the actual reason. Nell thought about it. She really did. She sat with it for a moment instead of reaching for the first easy answer. Because it's 2 a.m. Because you knocked on my door. Because whatever put you in that corridor in a jacket that isn't yours is your business, not mine. Because the room is empty, and has been empty for 3 years, and I walk past it every morning and every night, and I am apparently not as fine as I've been telling my daughter I am. She didn't say all of that. Because the room is empty, she said. You're here. That's the whole of it. Senna looked at her for a long time. Nell held still under the amber attention, and did not feel the need to fill the silence. Kethrani custom, Senna said finally, requires acknowledgement before a stay of more than 2 days. A witness, someone who can confirm you are where you say you are. I'll confirm it, Nell said. You're not Kethrani. No, Nell said, but I'm here and I know you're here. If that's not sufficient for the custom, tell me what is, and I'll learn it. Another pause. Then Senna picked up her cup, finished the tea, and set it down with a small, precise motion that had a formality to it, a completion gesture. I accept, she said. Thank you. The room's the second door on the left, Nell said. There should be an extra blanket in the storage unit. If there isn't, knock. Senna nodded once. She stood. She carried her cup to the sink, rinsed it, set it on the drying board with the same precise motion as before. Then she went to the second door on the left. Nell heard the lock engage. She sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. The invoices, the cold tea, the processors running their low note through the walls. And she felt the quality of the apartment's silence change. Not louder, not quieter. Different. She hadn't noticed how specific the silence had become until it shifted. Like a frequency she'd stopped registering until something nudged it sideways, and suddenly she could hear what had been missing. She sat with that for a while. Then she went to bed. And for the first time in longer than she could account for, she slept. Senna slept for 14 hours. Nell heard nothing from the second room until the following afternoon when the lock turned and the door opened and Senna appeared in the kitchen doorway. Still in the transit jacket. Barefoot now. Copper hair loose and slightly rumpled. The particular expression of someone waking in an unfamiliar place and spending a few seconds recalibrating before deciding where they are. Nell was at the stove. There's enough for 2, she said without turning. Sit down if you want. She heard the chair pull out, heard Senna sit. She was making a grain dish. Simple, sustaining, heavy on warming spices. The kind of thing she'd been making the same way for years without quite getting right. Thomas had always said it was fine, which meant it wasn't quite right because Thomas said things were fine when he meant they were adequate, and he said things were good when he meant they were actually good, and Nell had understood this distinction without ever pointing it out. She'd been alone with the grain dish for 3 years now, and it was still not quite right. The spice balance is off for this grain, Senna said from the table. I know, Nell said. More Harith oil, less dried keth, approximately 1/3 of what you're using. Nell adjusted the amounts, without comment, without asking for confirmation. The instruction was specific and authoritative, and she trusted it. She plated 2 bowls, set one in front of Senna, sat down with her own. Senna tasted it, quiet for a moment. Still slightly off, she said, but better. What's the correct ratio? Senna told her precisely. Harith oil to dried keth, the exact proportion, the order, the temperature at which each ingredient did what it was meant to do. She spoke about it the way someone talks about information they've held for so long it has stopped feeling like knowledge and just feels like obvious fact. Nell got up. She crossed to the shelf above the stove. She looked at the notebook for a moment. His handwriting on the cover small and precise. The worn texture of the binding from years of job sites and survey work. She took it down, opened it to a blank page near the back past all of his entries, and she wrote down the ratio. Senna watched her write it. You wrote it down, Senna said. If I don't write things down, I forget them, Nell said. This will be correct next time. She capped the pen. She sat down. She picked up her spoon and started eating. Senna looked at the notebook for a moment longer, at the 2 kinds of handwriting visible on adjacent pages, his compressed technical notes and her newer, slightly larger script. My mother wrote ratios on the inside covers of her cookbooks, Senna said, not looking at Nell. The annotation style is the same. Nell looked up. Is that relevant? She asked. No, Senna said. I just noticed. They ate. The processors ran outside, and at some point Senna looked up from her bowl, and the amber eyes had lost something. Not disappeared, but quieted. The careful watchfulness, still present, but lower, less immediate. The grain is better, Senna said. Good, said Nell. Iris called that evening. Nell took the call in the main room while Senna was still at the table finishing her tea. Iris Hale was 35 years old, lived on the upper residential ring, and called her mother on Tuesdays and Fridays, with the regularity of someone who had decided that regularity was the best way to love a person who kept insisting she was fine. How are you, Mom? Fine, Nell said. You sound different. Nell looked toward the kitchen. The light from the table lamp, the shape of Senna's copper head bent over her cup. I might have someone staying, she said. Silence on the line. Staying, Iris repeated. As in the apartment. In the second room. A longer silence. Mom. Who? A researcher. She needed somewhere. The room was empty. Since when do you open the door to strangers? At what time was it? 2 a.m. The silence had a specific quality. The silence of a daughter recalibrating. Are you okay? Iris said finally. Quietly. Nell thought about that. She genuinely considered it standing in her main room with the kitchen light spilling across the floor. I think so, she said. Yes. And she almost meant it entirely. The story came out over several days, in pieces. Not because Senna was reluctant, or not only that, but because it was not a simple story and she didn't think it deserved to be compressed. She told it the way people tell things when they've made a decision to trust someone and are still watching to see if the decision holds. One piece at a time, checking the ground before putting weight on it. 2 years at the xenobiology clinic on sublevel 9, a research position. Provisional appointment meant to become permanent if she met the review criteria. She had met them, and then exceeded them. The clinic had taken her on because she was exceptional, and because someone in clinic administration had been willing to look past the fact that her training was Kethrani origin rather than station certified. Her credentials were extensive and practical, and completely unrecognized in the form the administrative registry required. She'd done the work. She'd overshot every target in her second-year review. She'd applied for the permanent appointment. She'd been told the position had been restructured. Restructured, Nell said. Into a form a credentialed candidate could hold, Senna said, with the controlled flatness of someone who has already been angry about this and has decided that anger is a resource better spent elsewhere. The work I did for 2 years is not the same as having worked under the current registry system, so the position needed a different kind of person. That's not right, Nell said. No, Senna agreed. It isn't. She looked at her hands on the table. The clinic had let her go in the 3rd month of winter quarter. Savings 2 months of rent and living costs at sub-level 9 settlement rates. When that was nearly gone, she'd gone to the Kethrani Community Housing Register. Waiting list. 48th. A cousin on sub-level 3. A room. A week. A family dynamic she described only as not sustainable, and Nell heard everything in the precision of that choice of word. How did you find the corridor? Nell asked. I was walking, Senna said. I do that when I cannot think clearly, when the thinking keeps circling. She looked at the table. I walked for 2 hours. I ended up at Harrow's Reach. A pause. I saw the light under your door. I stood there for a while before I knocked. Nell thought about that. She thought about Senna in the corridor outside. She thought about how the light had been on because she couldn't sleep. How she'd been awake because she was fine and everything was fine. She thought about all the different versions of that night. The ones where she'd turned the light off and gone to bed. The ones where Senna had turned and walked away. I almost didn't, Senna said as if she'd followed the thought. I know, Nell said. Something moved through the amber eyes, small and quick. You're glad I did, Senna said. Not a question. Yes, Nell said, simply. I am. Senna looked at her cup, quiet for a moment. Then she looked up and said carefully, You haven't told me anything about yourself. Nell blinked. I talk about the loading bay. Yes, Senna said. The loading bay, the weight distribution error, the supervisor. A pause. Not much about before. Nell opened her mouth, closed it. Thomas would have laughed at that. The specific quiet laugh he used when he'd caught her out at her own game. There's not much that's interesting, she said. Senna looked at her with the amber eyes, level, patient, entirely unconvinced. I will decide that, she said. It came out with such calm certainty, the complete assumption that she was the appropriate authority on what she would find interesting, that Nell laughed. Actually laughed. Not the polite version, not the social version she'd been using for 3 years. The real one from somewhere lower. Senna looked briefly precisely satisfied. So Nell talked. Survey work mostly. 11 years of contract work across a dozen stations. Thomas and how they'd met on a geological mapping job, both of them arguing over the same site assessment from opposite conclusions, both of them eventually correct about different parts of it. The way he could read a room. The way he'd read her right from the start, in a way that had been occasionally annoying and ultimately irreplaceable. Iris on the upper ring and the calls every Tuesday and Friday. The year after Thomas died, when Nell had kept checking the time because he had always been home by a certain hour, and her body had not received the update. Senna listened the way she listened to everything, without performing interest, without waiting for her own turn. With the actual active processing of someone for whom what you're saying is going in and connecting to other things. Were you lonely? She asked when Nell paused. Nell considered that, seriously. After Thomas, she said. Some. The apartment is quieter than I expected. She looked at the kitchen, at the notebook on the shelf. I'm used to apartments that hold more than one person's weight. Senna looked at her cup. The Kathrani settlement houses are communal. I lived in shared space for most of my life. The clinic housing was individual units. A pause. I found it very quiet. Then we had the same problem, Nell said. Senna looked up. And the same solution, she said. And the same solution, Nell agreed. The end of the first week. A Tuesday. Senna was in the main room with a research document making notes in the margins when Nell came home from the loading bay. The news terminal on the wall was cycling through the station's quarterly report summaries. Routine. The kind of thing Nell scrolled past without reading. Senna was not scrolling past it. She was standing very still in the middle of the room, holding her document, looking at the terminal with the particular quality of stillness that is not calm, but its opposite. Nell followed her gaze. The screen was showing a summary from the sub-level 9 medical clinic. Standard quarterly performance metrics. One line highlighted in the summary display flagged as a significant result. Kathrani patient intake protocol implemented Q3. Improved treatment outcomes by 34%. Attribution Dr. Aldrich Morn, Clinical Director. Nell read it again, looked at Senna. Senna was not looking at the screen anymore. She was looking at the middle distance somewhere past the wall, and her hand, the one holding the research document, had gone very flat against her side. Controlled. The way you hold something when you've trained yourself not to show what you're holding. Senna, Nell said. I know, Senna said. Quietly. I know. She turned and went back to the main room. Sat in the chair. Picked up her document and looked at it with the deliberate return to work of someone for whom work is the only reliable ground under her feet when everything else has shifted. Nell stayed in the kitchen for a moment. She looked at the terminal, at the highlighted line, at the name. Dr. Aldrich Morn, Clinical Director, Sub-Level 9. She reached up and took the notebook from the shelf above the stove. She turned to the page where she'd written the grain dish ratio. She looked at the handwriting, hers now alongside Thomas's. 2 different kinds of precision sharing the same page. She turned to a new page. She wrote down the name. Then she went to the main room, sat in her chair, and picked up the invoices she'd been meaning to check. She didn't say anything. Neither did Senna. But the apartment held the quiet of 2 people who have arrived at the same understanding from different directions and have decided without discussing it to keep going. That night, after Senna had gone to bed, Nell opened her comm and looked up the name. Dr. Aldrich Morn, Clinical Director, Xenobiology Research Clinic, Sub-Level 9, appointed 8 months ago. Previous position, Deputy Director of the same clinic under the previous director who had retired. Appointed 8 months ago. Senna had been let go 3 months after the end of winter quarter. The timeline fit. It fit in the specific way that timelines fit when they aren't coincidences. Nell sat with that for a long time. The processors ran. The corridor outside was quiet in the way it got after midnight. The second room's light was off. She thought about Senna standing in the corridor outside her door. 45 minutes, she'd said. 3 doors before this one, she'd said. Not asking for much. Just a place to be. Just someone to confirm she was where she said she was. She thought about the grain dish and the notebook, and the careful way Senna rinsed her cup before she went to bed every night, as if she wanted to make sure she hadn't left any evidence of herself that someone would have to clean up. She thought about a woman who was exceptional at her work, who exceeded every target she was given, who was let go because the position was restructured into a form she couldn't hold, and she thought someone's name is on her work. She closed the comm. She sat for a long moment. Then she opened a different screen and looked up a name she'd kept in her contacts since the previous winter. Petra Voss. Records Coordination Office. Level 7. She didn't send a message yet. She just looked at the name. Because she needed to think about this carefully. Because Senna hadn't asked her to do anything. Because this was still Senna's situation, not hers to manage or solve or take over. Because the right kind of help was not the kind that swept in and assumed that treated the other person as a problem to be fixed, rather than an individual who had already been doing her own thinking for a very long time. She wrote one line in the notebook. Senna's work is running in the sub-level 9 clinic. The wrong name is on it. This is a problem with the recognition, not with the knowledge. She looked at that for a while, then wrote below it. Need to understand what documentation exists before saying anything. Ask first. Don't assume. She closed the notebook. She put it back above the stove. She went to bed. And again, for the second time since Senna had come through her door, she slept. The ventilation unit in the kitchen started rattling on a Thursday. Not loud, not constant, just present. An intermittent sound at unpredictable intervals, enough to be annoying when you were trying to read or think or sit in the kind of quiet that had become over 2 weeks. Something Nell had started relying on more than she'd expected. She'd been meaning to fix it for 6 months. She came home from the loading bay on Friday to find the access panel off the housing unit, and Senna on a stepladder, with her sleeves rolled up, and the unit's internal components laid out across the kitchen counter in precise, organized rows. Each piece separate. Each group arranged in the order it had been removed. 2 small labels in Senna's handwriting identifying sections she'd apparently needed to note. Nell stood in the doorway. Senna didn't look down. She was examining something in the housing with the focused attention she gave to everything she considered worth examining. You don't have to, Nell started. The 3rd conduit is worn through, Senna said, still not looking down. The others are intact. I need a replacement segment. 11 centimeters standard gauge D series. A pause. Do you have one? Nell had one. She kept a hardware kit out of years of contract work. The habit of someone who had learned early that on a job site the suppliers were always 2 hours away, and the problem was always right now. She found the segment and handed it up without comment. Senna fitted it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work before. Not casually. Competently. The way you are competent at things you've been trained for in conditions where doing them wrong had actual consequences. She replaced the panel, came down from the stepladder. The ventilation unit ran without rattling. Nell opened her mouth. Kethrani xenobiologists, Senna said before she could speak. Train in field conditions. Field conditions require structural improvisation. The amber eyes met hers level and slightly preemptive. A ventilation unit is not structurally dissimilar from field life support components. I wasn't questioning it, Nell said. You were about to say something. I was about to say thank you. A pause. Oh, Senna said. Then, you're welcome. She picked up the small labels she'd written and carried them to the recycling. She put the tools back exactly where she'd found them in the kit, closed it, and set it back on the shelf. Then she looked at the silent, correctly functioning ventilation unit with a small, satisfied expression. The expression she wore when something that had been wrong was now right. Nell watched her and thought, this is a person who fixes things because things should work correctly, not to prove anything, not to earn anything, just because they should work and they weren't. If you want, Nell said, there are 2 more units in the building that do the same thing. The building super has been ignoring them since last quarter. Senna looked at her. Is the super a friend of yours? Not particularly, but I know him. I would need to see the maintenance logs first, Senna said. I would want to confirm the fault type before offering. I can get you the logs. She considered this. All right, she said. I'll look at them. Not as a favor, not as payment, just as the logical next step when something was broken and she had the knowledge to address it. Nell got the logs. That was the 3rd week. And then there was the market. The sub-level market ran along the outer corridor of level 8 between the transit junction and the water processing units in the geography of a station where different populations overlapped without quite integrating. The Kethrani stalls were toward the back, past the general supply vendors, in a section that smelled of warming spices and something sharper underneath something that reminded Nell of survey sites she'd worked 20 years ago. Rock and cold air and distance. They went on a Saturday because they needed spices and because Nell had been meaning to go for months and kept finding reasons not to. Senna came with her research portfolio under her arm. She'd been to a morning meeting with a contact from the sub-level 3 community offices. Something about documentation. She hadn't elaborated and Nell hadn't pushed. They went together. Senna spent the better part of an hour at the spice stall. The vendor was a Kethrani woman of perhaps 60, with a weathered face and the patient expression of someone who had been selling from that stall long enough to know that a customer who asked real questions was worth the time. Senna asked real questions. Provenance of each variety, processing method, age of the batch, optimal storage on a low humidity station level. The vendor answered each one with careful respect. The respect you extend to someone who knows enough to know what to ask. At some point the vendor said something in Kethrani, looking between Senna and Nell with a measuring expression. Senna's ear tips went very faintly rose. She made a composed response. The vendor laughed warmly and began wrapping the spice order with particular care. On the walk back, Nell said, "What did she say?" Senna was quiet for a moment, looking at the corridor ahead. She said, Senna began carefully, that you carry the basket like someone who knows whose basket it is. Nell looked at the basket in her hand. She'd picked it up without thinking when they'd arrived because it was heavier than it looked, and Senna already had the portfolio. Is that an idiom? Yes. What does it mean? Senna glanced at her from the side, the amber eyes steady. It means she thinks I have made a good choice. Nell held that for a moment. The transit junction opening out ahead, the market noise fading behind them, the outer ring light falling pale through the upper windows. Have you? She said, quietly. The real question. Senna was quiet for longer than a moment. She gave it the full weight it was asking for. Yes, she said. I think I have. Nell didn't say anything back, not because she had nothing to say, but because Senna had said something true and exact, and it deserved to stand without crowding. They walked back through the junction and the outer ring corridor in a quiet that had stopped requiring management. Simply 2 people moving at the same pace through the same space. Nell thought about Thomas, about the way he used to say that silence was a skill most people never learned. that most people treated it like a gap to be filled rather than a thing with its own structure and weight. That the right answer to a precise thing was sometimes just to hear it and let it be heard. She thought she was finally understanding what he meant. She thought it had taken her 3 years and a young woman in a corridor at 2 a.m, and that was probably about right. The name was still in the notebook. Dr. Aldrich Morn. And the contact she'd looked up but hadn't called yet. Petra Voss. Records Coordination. Level 7. Nell had been thinking about it for 10 days, turning it over, making sure she understood what she was considering before she moved. Because the question wasn't whether to do something. The question was how to do it in a way that didn't take the situation out of Senna's hands, which meant asking first. She asked on a Sunday evening. Senna was at the kitchen table with her research notes. Nell was making tea. She set the cups down and sat across from her and said without preamble, "I need to ask you something about the protocol on the terminal last week." Senna set her notes down. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at Nell with the amber eyes level and waiting. So Nell asked what she knew about the protocol, whether she documented it, whether there was a submission trail, whether any of the clinic's internal records would show the timeline of her work relative to the implementation. Senna answered each question, precisely, without editorializing. The documentation existed. The proposal had been submitted with a registry number during her employment. The implementation had occurred 5 months after submission. There was theoretically a paper trail. Theoretically, Nell said. "I no longer have access to the clinic's internal registry," Senna said. Flat, not bitter, just accurate. And the cross-registry system requires a credentialed administrator to pull linked records, which I am not. Nell looked at her tea. "I know someone," she said. "In the records coordination office on level 7. Her name is Petra Voss. She handles cross-registry assessments. She's thorough and careful." A pause. "She owes me a favor from last winter." Senna looked at her. "I'm not promising anything," Nell said quickly. "I'm saying I know someone I can ask. I'd want to explain your situation and let her tell me if there's a path. That's all. No assumptions. No promises." Senna was very still, the amber eyes quiet. "Why?" she said. The same word she'd used on the first night with the same weight behind it. Nell thought about the grain dish, about the ratio in the notebook written in her own handwriting alongside Thomas's notes from survey jobs a decade old. She thought about the ventilation unit running clean and silent, about 2 weeks of mornings with tea already made when she came out of her room, the correct blend, the correct temperature set on the table without comment, as if it had always been this way. She thought about what it meant to be exceptional at something, and to have that exceptionalism absorbed by a system that then discarded you. "Because the ratio you gave me for the grain dish is in that notebook," she said. "And it's right. Everything you know is right. And the fact that it isn't formally recognized is a problem with the recognition, not with the knowledge." She paused. "You shouldn't have to carry that." Senna looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in her face that she wasn't suppressing and wasn't performing. Just letting it be there, giving it the weight it was asking for. "All right," she said finally, quietly. "Ask her." Petra Voss had worked in records coordination for 12 years. She was compact efficient and had the kind of memory for favors given and received that came from years of working in a system where goodwill was the only currency that moved faster than the official channels. She'd met Nell the previous winter when her father's water processing unit failed on sub-level 8, 2 days before the settlement's water allocation ran out. Nell had known a contact in the parts supply chain who could turn it around overnight at cost rather than through the standard markup. She'd made the call. The part arrived. Petra's father had water. Petra had not forgotten. She agreed to meet them in the level 7 corridor outside the records office during her lunch break 3 days after Nell's message. When they arrived, Petra looked at Senna for exactly 2 seconds, with the direct cataloging expression of someone processing new information efficiently. Then she said, "You're the researcher from sub-level 9. I've seen your intake protocol come through the cross-registry." Senna went very still. "You've seen it?" It flagged in the quarterly impact assessment, Petra said. Significant efficiency improvement in Kathrani presenting patient outcomes. Sub-level 9 clinic third quarter implementation. No author attribution. She looked at Nell. Which is unusual for something that specific and structured. That kind of work usually has a clear point of origin. That's what we're here about, Nell said. What followed was efficient and without drama, which was how Petra did everything. She pulled up the cross-registry record on her office terminal, walked Senna through the implementation timeline, found the proposal registry number referenced in the implementation document, confirmed the submission date. The date sat well within Senna's employment period, by 14 months. The formal credentials contribution claim process, Petra said, handing Senna a copy of the documentation, is a form and evidence requirement and a review timeline. There's a specific provision under the Multilateral Settlement Accord for exactly this category of case. Documented research output, produced during provisional employment, later implemented without attribution, applied toward credentials recognition. She paused. The evidence trail here is clean. Cross-registry impact assessment plus implementation date plus proposal registry number. 3 independent data points. 6 to 8 weeks for the board review. It's a strong claim. Senna took the document. She looked at it. Her ear tips had gone faintly rose at the edges. Thank you, she said. File the form promptly, Petra said. Impact windows expire. She looked at Nell. Debt cleared? Cleared, Nell said. Petra went back into the office. They stood in the level 7 corridor in the midday foot traffic of shift change. Senna held the document and did not speak for a moment. Are you all right? Nell asked. Senna looked at the document. I have been trying to understand this problem for 4 months. 3 months without work. 1 month before that watching it happen. She stopped. I spoke to 3 administrative offices. I was referred to 2 others. I read the registration protocols. A pause. And you asked 1 person. I asked the right one, Nell said. You did the hard part. You did the work that was worth finding. Senna looked at her. The corridor loud around them. Level 7 at shift change, the transit footsteps, and the general station noise of midday. And Senna standing in the middle of all of it looking at Nell with something that had stopped being careful. You are not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Nell asked. Senna thought about the corridor at 2 a.m. The 40 credits, the wall, the rehearsed list. Not you, she said. Nell held her gaze. File the form today, she said gently, while everything is fresh. Senna looked at her for one more moment. Then she straightened. Not the way someone straightens to compose themselves, but the way someone straightens when they have decided something and are done deliberating. Yes, she said. I will. She put the document in her portfolio. They filed the form that afternoon. And then 3 days later, Petra called again. Not a message. A call. Which meant it was urgent. Nell answered. Petra's voice clipped and carrying the flatness of someone delivering information they have already decided is not good. I did a deeper pull on the cross-registry, Petra said. There's something you need to know. Nell went to the kitchen doorway. Senna looked up from the table. Tell me, Nell said. Morn didn't just fail to attribute the work, Petra said. He filed a formal objection with the Credentials Board 8 months ago. Preemptive. Before any claim was filed. A pause. On record? Nell was very still. He filed an objection arguing that Kathrani origin training doesn't meet station certification standards and should not qualify for credentials recognition under the settlement accord. The filing was structured to preemptively disqualify any claim from that category of researcher. Petra's voice stayed level. Someone knew she might come looking, and moved to close the door before she got there. Senna had read it in Nell's face. She was already setting her notes down. The call ended. Nell set the comm on the table, looked at Senna. Senna's face had gone to the controlled stillness. The one she'd arrived with. That Nell hadn't seen in 2 weeks. It looked different now that Nell knew what it cost. He filed 8 months ago, Nell said, carefully. Right after he was appointed director, before your provisional contract even ended, which means, Senna said, he had access to the proposal registry as deputy director. He saw my submission, he saw the date, he saw my name. And then restructured your position. And then restructured my position. The silence again, not the comfortable kind. Nell looked at the notebook on the shelf, at the name she'd written 10 days ago. I want to go talk to him, Nell said. Senna looked at her sharply, not to threaten anything, not to make demands. I want to look at him and understand what we're actually dealing with. A pause. I won't say anything I haven't told you first. Senna studied her, reading her the way she'd read her in the corridor on the first night, except that she'd been reading a stranger then. All right, Senna said. Go. Nell went to sub-level 9 the next morning, early, before the clinic opened for patient hours. She knew from Thomas that the best time to talk to an administrator was before the day had given them reasons to be defensive. The sub-level 9 clinic was better maintained than Harrow's Reach. Wider corridors, brighter lights. The infrastructure of a section the station had decided was worth keeping functional. Morn's office was at the end of the administrative wing. She knocked. He opened. Dr. Aldrich Morn was perhaps 55, well-dressed in the understated way of people who have decided they don't need to try. Salt and pepper hair, an expression of practiced openness that Nell had seen before on men who had learned that appearing approachable was more efficient than being approachable. Ms. Hale. He'd looked up her name after her message. Of course he had. She came in. Sat. He sat across from her with the composed ease of someone who had managed difficult conversations before and had learned to sit at the center of them without showing the effort. She talked about Senna. Plainly. She didn't editorialize. She laid out what she knew, the 2 years of work, the exceptional reviews, the restructuring the protocol running under his name. Morn listened. His expression stayed open, attentive. He nodded in the right places. When she finished, he said, I understand your concern. The transition was difficult. We tried to handle it as fairly as possible given the registry requirements. The protocol, Nell said. The Kethrani patient intake protocol, the one in the quarterly report, with your name on it. The open expression didn't close. It became slightly more careful. The adjustment of a man recalibrating. That protocol emerged from a collaborative research environment, he said. During her time here, Dr. Vale contributed significantly to the foundational work that informed. She wrote it, Nell said. The proposal registry number in your implementation document matches her submission date. By 14 months. A pause. These things are complicated, he said. They really aren't, Nell said. The climate control in his office ran smoothly, quietly. Then Morn said she was given an option. Nell looked at him. When the restructuring was finalized, she was offered the opportunity to formalize the research attribution under a shared framework in exchange for a contract extension. He paused. She declined. Nell sat with that for a moment. She heard Senna's voice, quiet and precise from 2 nights ago. She thought about what Senna had said, and what it had cost to say it, and what it had meant. She declined, Nell said. It was her choice, he said. I respected it. And there it was. The thing she'd come to find. The shape of what they were dealing with. Not a man who had acted from malice. A man who had made a convenient arrangement, been turned down, and then made sure the door closed. No, Nell said. She stood up. He looked up at her. You didn't respect it, she said without heat, without drama, just accurate. You banked on it. You filed a preemptive objection with the Credentials Board 8 months ago. You structured the registry to make sure that even if she found the path, it would already be blocked. She held his gaze. That's not respecting a choice. That's profiting from it. Morn said nothing. We've filed the contribution claim, Nell said. Petra Voss in Records Coordination found the suppression filing. Both things are in the cross-registry now. She picked up her bag. I came to see whether you were someone who would fight this, she said, or someone who would understand when the math had changed. She walked out of his office, down the administrative corridor, through the main entrance, into the sub-level 9 corridor with its better lights and its wider pathways. She stood there for a moment, not triumphant, not relieved, just clear. She sent Senna a message on the transit back. 3 words. Math has changed. Senna's response came before Nell reached the Harrow's Reach junction. 2 words. Come home. Nell stopped walking. Read it again. Come home. Not come back. Not come to the apartment. Home. She stood there for a moment in the transit junction with the shift-change foot traffic moving around her. Then she walked the rest of the way. Senna was at the kitchen table when she came in. Notes spread out. 2 cups of tea already made. Nell sat down. She told Senna everything, all of it in order without editorializing. Senna listened with the complete attention she gave to everything. She asked 2 questions, both precise. When Nell finished, Senna was quiet for a moment. He offered me a contract extension, she said. He told me. I knew when I turned it down that he would close the door. She looked at her hands on the table. I did it anyway, because if I signed the protocol would have been his for the registry permanently, and every Kethrani patient who came through that clinic would be treated according to a framework built by someone who understood us as a category. She paused. Not as people. Nell looked at her. I chose the door closing, Senna said, over the alternative. That was the right choice, Nell said, something in the amber eyes, not quite surprise, adjacent to it. I know, Senna said. I just needed someone else to know it too. Nell reached across the table and opened the notebook to the page with Morn's name. She drew a single clean line through it. Senna watched. Then Petra called. Not a message. A call again. Which meant it was urgent again. Nell answered. Petra's voice, same flatness. The deadline on the contribution claim window, Petra said. I pulled the full accord provision. There's a time-sensitive clause I missed in the initial read. Impact windows for this category of claim expire 48 hours after initial filing confirmation. Nell went still. Meaning you filed the form. The clock started then. You have 48 hours from the filing confirmation timestamp to submit the full supporting evidence package to the board. After that, the window closes. No extensions. No appeals mechanism. The accord is specific. When did we file? 3 days ago. Nell looked at Senna across the table. Senna had read it in her face already. She was already reaching for her research portfolio. So we have, Nell said. 22 hours, Petra said. Approximately. The call ended. Nell set the comm down, looked at Senna. Senna looked back at her portfolio open notes, already being sorted with the quick, precise efficiency of someone who has done field work in conditions where speed and accuracy were not optional choices. Tell me what you need, Nell said. Everything with a registry number, Senna said, in chronological order. A pause. And more tea. Nell stood up and put the kettle on. They worked until 3 in the morning. The kitchen table covered in documents cross-reference notes. Senna's precise handwriting building the evidentiary architecture of 2 years of work that had been done quietly and well, and without anyone watching. Nell didn't build the case. That was not her job. Her job was to ask the question that clarified, to say when something wasn't clear enough, to push back when the logic had a gap. Walk me through the submission timeline again, she said at midnight, from the beginning, like I don't know anything. Senna walked her through it again, and in the explaining she found the gap herself. A missing cross-reference between the proposal registry entry and the clinical implementation log. 2 documents that needed a third to connect them. She found it in her own notes, added it. The architecture held. There, Nell said. There, Senna agreed. At 2 in the morning, Senna looked up from the table, eyes tired, Ear tips faintly rose with the effort of sustained concentration. "You're good at this," she said. Nell looked up. "At what?" "At asking the question that matters. Not all the questions. The one that actually opens the problem." Nell thought about Thomas, about load-bearing walls, about knowing which one to look at. "Someone taught me," she said. Senna looked at her for a moment, then looked back at her notes. They submitted the evidence package at 3:47 in the morning, 6 hours and 13 minutes before the window closed. Nell sent the confirmation to Petra. Petra responded in under a minute. One line clean. Strong. Board has it now. Nell showed Senna. Senna read it. Set the comm down. Looked at the organized stacks of documents, the cross-references, the carefully structured argument they had built together in a kitchen in the outer ring at nearly 4 in the morning. "Now we wait," Senna said. "Now we wait," Nell agreed. Senna began stacking the documents with the precise, methodical care she brought to everything. Each piece in order, each stack aligned. Nell watched her and thought, this is a person who tidies up after herself because she is already thinking about what comes next. Who puts things in order because she has learned that order is the only thing you can count on when everything else is uncertain. She thought, I know something about that. She picked up her tea. Cold now. Drank it anyway. The processors ran their low note through the walls. The corridor was quiet at this hour, the deep night quiet of Harrow's Reach, when the shift changes had settled, and the foot traffic had thinned to nothing, and the kitchen held the warmth of a place where two people had been working towards something that mattered. The low light, the organized table, 2 cups, the notebook open to a page with a clean line through a name that was not any more the last word on anything. Get some sleep, Nell said. Senna looked at her. So should you. I will. Senna stood. She carried her cup to the sink, rinsed it, set it on the drying board. The same precise motion every night, every cup. Then she paused at the kitchen doorway. Nell. Nell looked up. Thank you, Senna said. Not for fixing it. For standing next to me while I fixed it. Nell held her gaze. That's the only kind of thank you that means anything, she said. Senna nodded once. Small, certain. She went to the second room on the left, the lock engaged, and Nell sat alone at the kitchen table in the low light of nearly 4 in the morning with the notebook and the cold tea and the processors running their steady note through the walls, and felt the apartment hold the weight of 2 people and thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like. This. Right here. The waiting was its own kind of work. Not dramatic, not loud, just present. The weight of something unresolved sitting in the corner of every ordinary moment like a low sound you can't quite locate, but can't stop noticing either. 6 weeks, Petra had said. Maybe 8. So they waited, and life continued the way life continues when you are waiting for something that matters. The loading bay. The grain dish getting closer to correct each time. The tea already made when Nell came out of her room each morning, the right blend, the right temperature set on the table without comment, as if it had always been this way, as if the mornings had always had this shape. The ventilation unit running clean and quiet above the stove, the notebook accumulating entries, the routine of the apartment continuing and deepening and becoming gradually something different than routine, becoming the kind of ordinary that has its own specific gravity, the kind you only understand the weight of when you try to imagine it absent. Iris came on a Wednesday. She called first, which she always did, and Nell said, of course, come and set out 3 cups because Senna was home and there was no reason to make it strange by pretending otherwise. Iris arrived with the particular energy of a woman who had been trying to read a situation from a distance for several weeks and had decided that the only way to read it accurately was to come see it herself. She was 35. She had Thomas's eyes and Nell's stubbornness and a directness she'd developed entirely on her own through years of watching her mother deflect questions with logistical precision. She came through the door and stopped. Senna was at the kitchen table with her research notes. She looked up. Iris looked at her, then at the table, at the 3 cups Nell had already set out. at the way the kitchen felt, which was the way it had felt for years before Thomas died, and had stopped feeling after, and had apparently started feeling again, without Nell's explicit permission or announcement. "Hello," Senna said. "Hi," Iris said, still in the doorway. "I'm Iris." "Senna Vale, your mother has mentioned you." This clearly surprised Iris, because Nell didn't mention people. She said things were fine and redirected inquiries with practical information, and then spent the next several months quietly solving problems she hadn't told anyone she had. They had tea, all three of them, at the kitchen table. Senna talked about the research, about the board review, about the sub-level 5 clinic that had reached out after reading the cross-registry assessment independently. Iris asked good questions. Senna answered them precisely, and Nell sat in her chair at her kitchen table and drank her tea and felt for the first time in 3 years like the person sitting there was herself. Not the version that said fine. The real one. The one Thomas had known. Later, when Senna went to the main room, Iris looked at Nell across the table. "Mom," she said. "I know," Nell said. "You seem—" "I know." "Like yourself," Iris finished, quietly. "You seem like yourself again." Nell didn't answer right away. She looked at her cup. She looked at the notebook on the shelf. She looked at the second door on the left, which was no longer closed with the specific finality it had carried for 3 years. "Don't make it more than it is," Nell said. "I'm not," Iris said. "I'm just saying what I see." A pause. "Dad would have liked her," Iris said. Nell looked at her. "He would have asked about the field research," Iris said. "He would have wanted to understand the structural work in xenobiology conditions. He would have asked too many questions, and she would have answered every single one without making him feel like he'd asked too many." Nell looked at the notebook, at the handwriting on the cover. "Yes," she said. "He would have." Iris left an hour later. She hugged Nell at the door, which she did every visit, but this time she held on a beat longer than usual. Nell let her. After the door closed, she stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she took the notebook off the shelf, opened it to a new page. Wrote, "Iris came today. She said I seem like myself again." She looked at that, then wrote below it, "I think she might be right." The letter from the board arrived on a Tuesday, 6 weeks and 2 days after they submitted the evidence package. Nell found it in the shared comm queue in the morning before Senna was awake. It was addressed to Senna, routed through the apartment's registered address. Nell set it on the table and made tea and sat down and did not open it, because it wasn't hers to open. When Senna came out of the second room, she saw it immediately. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, barefoot, hair loose, the expression of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and now that it has arrived, doesn't quite know how to approach it. "It came," she said. "It came," Nell said. Senna came to the table. She sat. She looked at the comm for a long moment. Nell said nothing, did not tell her to open it, did not reach across and do it for her, just sat with her tea in the quiet that had become theirs. Senna opened the comm. She read it, once, then again, her face very still. 3 paragraphs, formally worded, administrative language completely free of flourish. It confirmed the contribution claim had been reviewed. It confirmed the evidence was sufficient. It confirmed in the precise language of official recognition that her research output qualified for credentials registration under the Multilateral Settlement Accord, that she could apply for formal xenobiological research registration within the current quarter. The suppression filing by Dr. Morn had been noted in the review record and dismissed. 1 line. Clean and final. Senna set the comm down on the table. She looked at it. She stayed very still. Nell watched her. She watched the careful control of someone who had spent 4 months telling herself not to hope for this too much, who had learned somewhere along the way that hope was a resource that had to be managed carefully, because when it ran out it cost more than anything else. And she watched that control come down. Not dramatically, not all at once, quietly. The way walls come down, when the structural reason for them no longer exists. Nell got up. She made more tea. She set a fresh cup beside the comm and sat back down. She didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. After a while, Senna said, I was trying not to hope for this too much. I know, Nell said. The last time I built something I expected to be recognized. She stopped. I know, Nell said again, gently. Senna looked at her, the amber eyes open. Not guarded, not measuring. Just open the way they had been since the market and the basket and the answer she'd given walking in the outer ring light. I am very glad, Senna said, that you opened the door. Nell thought about the light under the door, the 40 credits, the rehearsed list, the hand flat against the wall. She thought about Thomas reading rooms, about knowing which wall to look at, about sitting outside rooms for 4 hours because you'd know I was there. She reached across the table and set her hand over Senna's. Senna looked at it. Her hand was still for a moment. Then she turned it and held on. You're going to get the grain dish wrong again tomorrow, Senna said. Almost certainly, Nell agreed. I will correct you. I'm counting on it. The processors ran outside. The letter was on the table, and the kitchen held the warmth of the kind of morning you don't recognize as significant until later when you understand what it was the beginning of. Then Morn appealed. Petra called that afternoon. Same voice, same flatness carrying different information. He filed a formal appeal this morning, Petra said, requesting a direct hearing before the Credentials Board. He has 72 hours to establish grounds, then the board schedules the hearing. Standard timeline from there is 5 to 7 days. Nell looked at Senna across the kitchen table. Senna had gone very still. Which means, Nell said, the board's decision stands pending the hearing, Petra said. But if he establishes sufficient grounds, the implementation could be delayed, potentially significantly. What grounds could he have? Procedurally limited, but he can argue the review didn't adequately weigh the registry standards. It's a long shot, but it forces a hearing. A pause. He's making her stand up in front of them. Nell understood. It wasn't about winning the appeal. It was about making the process exhausting enough that it might stop being worth continuing. The specific calculation of someone who understood that even legitimate systems could be made to grind. When is the hearing? Nell asked. 5 days. The call ended. Nell set the comm down. Looked at Senna. Senna was looking at the letter on the table, at the 3 paragraphs that had said her name and her work and her knowledge in the same sentence. That had said, this is real, this counts, this is yours. And now, 5 more days. I'll be there, Nell said. Senna looked up. You don't have to. I know, Nell said. A pause. I know, she said again. I'll be there. Something moved through the amber eyes, quick and real. All right, Senna said. They prepared for 5 days. Nell did not prepare Senna's argument. That was not hers to do. But she sat across the table every evening after her shift and she asked the question that mattered. Not all the questions. The one that opened the problem. Day 1. Walk me through what you're saying. From the beginning. Like I'm a board member who has never seen a Kathrani patient. Day 2. You're assuming they understand why attribution matters. They might not. Explain it like they don't. Day 3. He's going to say the registry standards are the registry standards. What do you say back? Senna answered. Revised. Went deeper. Found the places where the argument had gaps and filled them not with more words, but with more clarity. On the 4th evening, Nell listened to the full argument from start to finish without interrupting. When Senna finished, Nell was quiet for a moment. You're not defending your work, she said. Senna looked at her. You're teaching them why it matters, Nell said. There's a difference. Defense says this is mine and you took it. Teaching says this is how this works, and here is what is lost when the record is wrong. She paused. The second is harder to argue against. Senna looked at her for a long time. Thomas, she said. Not quite a question. Nell looked up. The person who taught you to find the right wall, Senna said. Nell was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. Senna nodded. Small, Certain. The nod she gave when something had been fully understood. He sounds like someone worth learning from, she said. Nell looked at the notebook on the shelf, at his handwriting on the cover, at the pages inside that now held his notes and hers and Senna's ratio, and the record of 8 weeks of a life that had started coming back together without her quite noticing it was happening. He was, she said. He really was. The hearing was at 9 a.m, Level 4 Administrative Wing, a room designed to feel neutral that managed mostly to feel cold. Nell arrived with Senna at 8:40. They walked the 16 corridors from Harrow's Reach together, not rushed, not performing calm, just walking. The way you walk when you have done everything you can do and the rest is not in your hands. Senna had her research portfolio, her credentials documentation. 5 days of preparation organized into a structure as clean and precise as everything she built. She was wearing her own jacket, not the transit worker's jacket 3 sizes too large. Her own. The right size. Nell had noticed weeks ago when Senna had gone to collect her things from her cousin's building and come back with 2 bags and a jacket that fit. Nell hadn't commented on it, but she'd noticed. At the Level 4 entrance, Senna stopped. She looked at the door. Nell stood beside her. "All right?" Nell asked. "Yes," Senna said. "Then, I was not expecting when I stood in your corridor 8 weeks ago for any of this." "What were you expecting?" "To be turned away," Senna said, possibly with a comment about the hour. A pause. "I had a route plan for where to go afterward." "I'm glad you didn't need it," Nell said. Senna looked at her in the Level 4 corridor light, which was cleaner than the Harrow's Reach light, better maintained, the kind of light that showed things clearly. The copper of her hair very warm, the amber of her eyes steady and open, and looking at Nell with the full founded attention she gave to things she had decided mattered. "You are a very unusual woman, Eleanor Hale," she said. "You've said that before," Nell said. "I mean it each time." Nell looked at her. She thought about the second room door and the lock engaging and the change in the apartment's silence that she'd felt sitting at the kitchen table that first night afterward. The first full sleep, the grain dish and the notebook, the ventilation unit running quietly, the market and the basket and the question asked while walking in the outer ring light, and the answer that had deserved to stand without crowding. All of it had come from one moment in which she hadn't closed the door on a person in a corridor at 2 a.m. She'd thought at the time it was the smallest possible thing. She was beginning to understand it had been everything. "Go in," she said. "You're going to be very good at this." "I am aware of that," Senna said with the matter-of-fact precision that was not arrogance but simply accurate. Nell laughed. The real one. Senna looked briefly, completely, brilliantly pleased at making her laugh. Then she straightened, turned, opened the door, went in. Nell sat in the corridor outside. There were seats along the wall. She took one, folded her hands in her lap, sat. The hearing was not public. She had known this. She was not in the room. She was outside it in a Level 4 administrative corridor at 9 a.m, sitting with the patience of someone who has learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is be present on the other side of the door. Thomas had sat outside rooms for her. Contract hearings, technical reviews. The time the mine survey crew had challenged her geological assessment, and she'd had to defend it to a panel of 3 engineers who came in skeptical and left with a different read. He'd sat outside that room for 4 hours. She'd asked him afterward why he'd stayed the whole time. He'd said, "Because you'd know I was there." She hadn't fully understood it then. She'd thought it was sweet, slightly impractical. She understood it now completely. She sat. The corridor had its own rhythms. Administrative staff moving between offices, the transit junction noise filtering down from the level above, the atmospheric processors running their low note under everything, the sound of a station doing what it does. An hour passed. Maybe more. She wasn't watching the time. And then the door opened. A woman came out who was not Senna, not the board, not Morn's legal representative who had arrived at 8:55 with a briefcase and the expression of a professional doing a job she found mildly distasteful. The woman was perhaps 40, station medical staff from the badge on her jacket. She stopped when she saw Nell, looked at her. "Are you here for the Vale hearing?" she asked. "Yes," Nell said. "So am I." She paused. "I'm Dr. Solène Briard. I work at the Sub-Level 9 clinic." Nell looked at her. "You work for Morn." "I work at the clinic," Briard said with the careful precision of someone making a distinction that matters to her. "I use the Kathrani intake protocol every shift. Have done since it was implemented." She paused. "I looked up the cross-registry assessment 2 weeks ago. I followed the record." Nell was very still. "Nobody asked you to come," Nell said. "No," Briard said. "Nobody knew you were coming." "No," Briard said again, simply. She looked at Nell with the expression of someone who has made a decision based on something simpler than strategy. "The record should be accurate," she said. "I wanted to say that while there was still a hearing to say it in." She turned and went back through the door. It closed behind her. Nell sat. She thought that's how it happens. Not with grand gestures, not with speeches, with one person who uses something every day, deciding that the name in the record should match the hand that built it. With a woman who walked through a door nobody asked her to walk through. Not entirely unlike Nell thought a certain corridor at 2 in the morning. She sat with that for a long time. The door opened again at 11:47. Senna came out first. She was carrying her portfolio, her face very still in the controlled way, except that Nell knew now what it looked like when Senna was holding something carefully, so it didn't spill before she was ready. Morn's legal representative came out behind her, spoke briefly on a comm, and left without looking at either of them. Then Senna looked at Nell, and the stillness came down, not collapsed, released. The way you release something you've been holding for a long time, when you've finally reached the place where you can set it down. "Well?" Nell said. "The appeal was dismissed," Senna said. "The board upheld the original decision. The contribution claim is confirmed." She paused. Morn withdrew the appeal partway through, after Dr. Briard spoke. Nell nodded. "The chair read the formal determination into the record," Senna said. "Name and credential qualification and research attribution. All of it." "They said your name," Nell said. "They said my name," Senna said. A pause. "Out loud. In the record." Her voice was entirely steady. Her ear tips were very faintly rose at the edges, and in the amber eyes something that was not composed and was not performing anything, and was simply completely real. "Nell," she said. "I know," Nell said. "I was not prepared for how that felt." "I know," Nell said again, gently. "I wasn't either." And she meant that. Both parts of it. Because she had heard it through the closed door. The formal language of the board reading Senna's name into the official record of a station that had spent 4 months pretending she hadn't done the work. And she had felt something shift in her own chest. Not her victory. She knew that. This was not hers, but she had been there for it. She had been on the other side of that door. And that was different from not being there. That was exactly what Thomas had spent years trying to teach her about what presence actually meant. She stood up from the corridor seat, picked up her bag. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home." She said it without thinking, and didn't take it back. Senna looked at her, then looked at the level 4 corridor, the administrative wing with its clean lights and its neutral walls, and the closed door of the hearing room. "Yes," she said. "Let's." They walked back through the 16 corridors. The Sub-Level 5 clinic had contacted Senna 3 days before the hearing. Nell had read the message over Senna's shoulder because Senna had held the comm out to her without comment, which was how they shared things now without preamble or ceremony. The clinical director at Sub-Level 5 had read the cross-registry impact assessment independently, had followed it to Senna's name without intermediary, had contacted her directly. The position was not provisional, it was registered. Full credentials, research allocation, a housing unit on Sub-Level 5. Senna had not answered yet, because of the hearing. She answered that evening. She sent the acceptance from the kitchen table with Nell across from her and tea between them, while the processors ran outside, and the notebook sat on the shelf above the stove, and the second room door was open the way Senna had started leaving it in the mornings, and neither of them had mentioned it. She sent it, set the comm down, looked at Nell. "The housing unit is on sublevel 5, she said. "I know," Nell said. "Sublevel 5 is 16 corridors from Harrow's Reach." "I know," Nell said again. A pause. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the low evening light. And Senna said with the exactness she brought to things that mattered, "I would like to remain in this arrangement, whatever form it takes. I would like to choose it, and I would like to know whether you choose it." Nell thought about everything. The grain dish, the notebook, the ventilation unit, the market and the basket, and the question asked walking in the outer ring light, 3 in the morning, and the evidence package and the cold tea they'd drunk anyway because they were still working. Iris saying, "You seem like yourself again." Thomas sitting outside rooms for 4 hours because you'd know I was there. The light under the door. All of it had been building towards something. And she'd known it for a while now, in the way you know things you haven't yet let yourself look at directly. And here was Senna, on her own ground, having found her footing, asking. "I choose it," Nell said. Senna looked at her, and the careful architecture she'd maintained since the first night, the measured distance, the precise accounting of what she offered and what she asked, came down quietly, all at once, not collapsed, released. She looked at Nell across the table with the full warmth she had been holding back for 8 weeks. It was the look she gave to things she'd finally traced to their source, complete and settled, entirely her own. Nell got up from her side of the table. Senna got up from hers. They met in the middle of the kitchen. Nell held her. Senna held on with the same precise grip she'd used when she turned her hand in Nell's, and the processors ran their note outside, and the apartment was warm and quiet, and full, and full, and full. The first day at sublevel 5 started on a Monday. Senna was up before her usual time. When Nell came out of her room at 6, tea was already made, and Senna was at the table with her portfolio going through her notes, with the concentrated attention of someone reviewing work they already know completely. Not anxious, prepared. There was a difference, and Nell could see it clearly. "How do you feel?" Nell asked. Senna looked up. She was wearing her own jacket, her copper hair arranged in the formal style she used for professional settings, her research credentials card already visible in her jacket pocket. "Ready," she said. Nell sat down, drank her tea, looked at the woman across from her who had arrived 8 weeks ago with 40 credits and a jacket that wasn't hers, and a rehearsed list of what she could offer in exchange for a place to sleep, who had in those 8 weeks fixed the ventilation unit and taught her the grain dish ratio, and walked beside her through a market and an appeal and a hearing and 4 months of closed doors, and come out the other side with her name in the official record of DHT station, in the credentials board determination, in the formal appointment letter from the sub-level 5 clinic, her name in the record, exactly where it belonged. "Ready," Nell repeated. "Yes, you are." They walked the 16 corridors together. Nell had offered the walk the night before, simply, "I'll walk with you." Senna had looked at her and said, "All right." Nothing more than that. So they walked. Early enough that the transit corridors were still quiet, the between-hour quality of a station that runs continuously and has no real morning but has this slightly softer window before full operations begin. The sub-level 5 clinic entrance was at the end of a wider corridor. Better lights, cleaner walls, the infrastructure of a section recently expanded and properly funded. Senna stopped at the door. She looked at it, not hesitating, acknowledging it, the way you acknowledge a threshold before you cross it. "Thank you for walking with me," she said. "Any time," Nell said. Senna looked at her. In the sub-level 5 corridor light, clear and steady, the copper of her hair was very warm, and the amber of her eyes was open and looking at Nell the way she looked at research she'd spent years on. with the deep, thorough-founded attention of someone who has done the work and knows exactly what she has found. I came to your door with 40 credits and a list of what I could offer, Senna said. I was prepared to be entirely practical about it. I know, Nell said. I was not prepared for you, Senna said, for what it was like to be in a space where I didn't have to earn each morning. Nell was quiet. You gave me the room, Senna said, and then the mornings, and then you stood outside a hearing room for 3 hours without being asked. She paused. I want you to know that I know what that is. I know you know, Nell said. I wanted to say it anyway, Senna said, out loud, while we're standing here. Nell looked at her. At this precise, exacting, extraordinary person who had knocked on 3 doors before hers and been turned away at all of them, who had stood in a dim corridor for 45 minutes, deciding whether she deserved to ask, who had said, I can cook, I can clean, I can stay quiet, as if those were the only things she had to offer, as if the grain dish ratio and the ventilation unit and the evidence architecture and the 22 hours of deadline work and the 2 years of research that was now in the official record as hers were not also things she had, as if she was still learning what she was worth. Well, weren't they both? Go in, Nell said. You're going to be very good at this. I am aware of that, Senna said, and Nell laughed. Again, the real laugh. Senna looked briefly, completely, brilliantly pleased. Then she turned and opened the door and went in, and it closed behind her. Nell stood in the corridor for a moment, the sub-level 5 light clean and steady falling through the upper windows, the processors running their note through the walls. 16 corridors between here and Harrow's Reach. She turned and walked back. She thought about Thomas, about all the time she'd walked away from something and he'd been there when she got back, about the way he used to say that the most important thing in any structure was knowing which walls were load-bearing, that you could change almost anything, adapt almost anything, as long as you understood what was holding it up. She thought she knew now. She thought she had known for a while. That evening, Senna came home with a particular quality of tired. Not the depleted kind. Not the kind that follows effort spent on the wrong things. The other kind. The kind that follows a long day of using the right muscles of doing work that actually fits. She set down her portfolio in the doorway, stood in the kitchen in her own jacket with her copper hair slightly loosened from its formal arrangement. She looked at Nell at the stove. How was it? Nell asked. Excellent, Senna said. Precisely. The clinical director is thorough. The research infrastructure is well organized. 3 of the staff had already read the cross-registry assessment. She paused. They knew the intake protocol. They knew where it came from. A pause. They credited me by name, she said. In the morning meeting. Nell turned from the stove. By name, she said. By name, Senna said again. She looked at Nell with the expression she wore when something that had been wrong was now right. The look of a recalibrated instrument. Settled. Accurate. Finally. I was not prepared, she said quietly, for how that felt. Nell set down the spoon. She thought about 4 months of closed doors, 3 administrative offices, 2 referrals, 48 hours of deadline pressure, 3 hours outside a hearing room. A name read into the official record of a station that had spent a long time pretending the wrong person's name was in it. You should have been credited 2 years ago, Nell said. Yes, Senna said. I should have been. A pause. But I was credited today. That is the fact I have now. She took off her jacket and hung it up and came to the kitchen and looked at what Nell was making. Harith oil is slightly low, she said. I was going to add more. Add it now. Nell added it. Senna made her tea and sat at the table. Nell finished the dish and plated it, and they ate together, and Senna told her the details of the first day. The research brief she'd been handed. The gap in the current literature she'd identified before lunch. The question she'd asked in the morning meeting that the clinical director had said was exactly the right question. Nell listened and asked the question that mattered. Senna answered it. They were in the kitchen together at the end of the day, which was where they had been every day for 8 weeks, and was where Nell thought they would continue to be. Later, after the dishes were done and the tea was made correctly, both cups, Nell picked up the notebook from above the stove. She looked at its pages. The grain dish ratio, week 1. The ventilation segment note, week 2. A clean line through a name that was no longer the obstacle it had been. The entry about Iris's visit. The line about not hoping too much. She turned to a clean page. She wrote Senna's first day at sub-level 5. They credited her by name in the morning meeting. She looked at that, then added. She was not prepared for how that felt. Then after a pause, neither was I. She looked at those 3 lines for a moment, then wrote below them. She came home with the right kind of tired. And then tea was correct tonight. Both cups. The ratio is now automatic. She put the notebook back above the stove. Senna was on the low chair in the main room. Research notes. The reading lamp she'd brought from the second room angled correctly over her shoulder. Legs tucked under her the way she sat when she had stopped managing the space she took up and was simply in it. She looked up when Nell came in. "The notebook," she said. "I write things down," Nell said. "What did you write?" Nell sat on the other end of the chair, not across the table, beside her. "The way you sit when you are no longer maintaining a careful distance and haven't been for some time. That you were credited by name," she said. "That you came home with the right kind of tired. That the tea was correct." Senna looked at her. "You wrote that." "I wanted to keep it," Nell said. Senna looked at her for a long moment, the full amber attention, reading her the way she'd read her in the corridor on the first night, except that she'd been reading a stranger then. Now she was reading someone she knew completely, someone she'd been learning for 8 weeks with the same focused, thorough care she gave to everything she considered worth knowing. She put her research notes on the table beside the lamp. She turned toward Nell. She took her hand. "You opened the door," she said. "You knocked," Nell said. "We've had this argument." "It's not an argument," Senna said. "We both did our part." Nell looked at her. At this person who had come through her door with nothing and had brought, without knowing it, everything the apartment had been missing. Not because she was extraordinary, though she was. Because she was present. Because she had needed somewhere to be, and had found somewhere, and had simply been there fully without apology or performance, and had let Nell be there too. Outside Harrow's Reach moved through its unremarkable night. The corridor lights cycled through their dimmer sequence. Shift changes came and went. The atmospheric processors ran their note through the walls, the sound of a station doing what stations do, consistent and impersonal, and oddly reassuring once you stopped trying to tune it out. None of it was different from any other night. None of it would look like anything to anyone who didn't know what it held. Inside, the door was closed. The light was on. The notebook was on the shelf above the stove with its entries and its ratios and the small, careful record of things worth keeping because someone who understood the value of an accurate record had started keeping one on the night a stranger knocked and was not turned away. On the counter, the spices from the sub-level market in the order Senna had specified, labeled in her handwriting. On the table, her research notes and the lamp with its warm angle of light. On the shelf, the hardware kit with the gap where the D-series segment had been, the ventilation unit above it running clean and silent. In the notebook, 2 kinds of handwriting now. His compressed technical script and hers the record of a life that had stopped and started and was going again. The second room door opened. Tea made every morning without comment. The right kind of tired at the end of a right kind of day. 2 people on a low chair in a Harrow's Reach apartment holding on, and the light under the door still on.